A forgotten attic, a mysterious box, and the past waiting to be opened. Imagine this for a moment. It is a quiet evening, the kind you do not get too often anymore. The rain outside is soft, steady, almost like a lullaby against the roof. You decide to slip upstairs, away from the noise of the world, into the old attic that smells faintly of cedar and dust. The air up here feels different still and cool. Shadows stretch across wooden beams, where boxes and forgotten trunks are stacked like tiny monuments to another time. You duck beneath a low rafter and brush a cobweb from your sleeve, smiling a little at how still everything is. It almost feels like the attic itself is holding its breath, waiting. You're not sure what you are looking for. Maybe an old photo, maybe just a quiet corner to think. But then, in the farthest corner, you see it. A box, not a large one, 18 inches long, a foot wide, carved from dark oak. The brass hinges are dull with age, and the lid is covered by a piece of yellowed canvas. It looks like it has been sitting here for decades, untouched. You crouch down, your fingertips brushing across the rough wood. The grain is raised in places, splintered by time. In the center is a small keyhole, but there is no key in sight. Strangely, the lid opens anyway, with a soft click that seems far too gentle for the heavy air around you. Inside are fragments, an old photograph, edges curled and faded, a small leather-bound journal, the cover cracked but still warm to the touch, a brass compass, its needle spinning wildly as if lost, and at the very bottom, folded into a perfect square, a single piece of parchment that looks as though it might crumble if you even breathe on it too hard. You lift the parchment carefully, holding your breath as the attic suddenly feels heavier. The shadows seem to lean closer, and then you hear it, a voice. It is not a voice you recognize. It does not belong to anyone in the room because you are the only one here. Low and steady, it rises from the floorboards, the walls, the very air around you. Do you know what you are holding? You freeze, glancing over your shoulder, but there is only the attic, silent and waiting. These are not just relics, the voice says. They are doorways. Each one will take you back to places and moments that shaped this country. If you are willing to go, you swallow hard and look down at the items again. The photograph, the journal, the compass, or the voice continues softly. You can close the box, walk back downstairs, and forget you ever found it. The choice is yours, but know this. Once you step through, you will not be the same when you return. You stare at the journal, your pulse quickening. The leather is cracked, the pages barely holding together. But when you open it, you see ink written in a trembling hand, words from someone long gone. We came across the ocean, hungry for a place to belong. We found danger, death, and hope. If anyone reads this, know that we believed in tomorrow. The attic light flickers. You can almost see them now, people stepping off wooden ships into an unknown wilderness. The scent of salt water and pine thicken the air. You can hear the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the creak of doors on a village that barely deserves the name. And just like that, the attic is gone. You are standing on the deck of a ship, the ocean stretching endlessly behind you. The year is 1607. Ahead lies a narrow riverbank in Virginia, the trees towering 100 feet overhead, the soil rich but unbroken. This is where your story begins. An unforgiving ocean, a crowded ship, and 100 lives chasing you away. The air hits you first cold, sharp, filled with the salt of the ocean. You blink hard against the sting of the wind, your hands gripping the wooden railing slick with seawater. When your eyes adjust, you realize you are standing on the deck of a ship. A tall mast creaks above you, sails snapping like great white wings against a sky the color of slate. The ship's name, painted in faded letters on the bow, reads Susan Constant. The deck is crowded with people, men with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, women clutching children close, crewmen hauling ropes and buckets of seawater. You can hear the groan of timbers beneath your feet as the ship rolls with the waves. It has been at sea for months. A man in a heavy coat pushes past you, carrying a small wooden chest. He gives you a nod, his expression equal parts polite and exhausted. Others do not even look up. Everyone is focused on enduring this endless crossing. You move toward the stern, bracing yourself against the wind. The ocean stretches forever in every direction. No land in sight, just water and sky. It is both beautiful and unsettling. Hold tight, someone calls out. You turn and see him, a broad-shouldered man standing near the helm, his boots planted wide on the deck. His weathered face is set in a look of calm authority, the kind that draws people in even in the worst of storms. "Captain John Smith," someone whispers beside you. Smith shouts orders to the crew, voice cutting clean through the wind. "Secure the sails. Double-check the barrels of fresh water. We can't afford to lose a single drop." You watch as sailors scramble to obey, tying ropes with quick, practiced hands. The captain notices you standing near the rail and, for a moment, his stern expression softens. "First time at sea?" he asks, raising an eyebrow. You nod. "Well," he says with a wry half-smile. "You picked one heck of a voyage. Stay close. It is rougher than it looks." He turns back to the helm, barking more orders as a swell of icy water crashes over the bow. A woman screams as a wooden crate slides across the deck, but two crewmen catch it before it tumbles into the sea. The days blur together. You share cramped quarters below deck with dozens of others, the air thick with damp wood and the faint smell of sickness. Meals are simple hardtack biscuits, salted meat, a bit of dried fruit when you are lucky. Water is rationed carefully, every drop precious. One evening, as the ship rocks gently under a rare clear sky, you find yourself sitting on deck with a young boy no older than 10. He clutches a wooden bowl and looks down at the small piece of bread inside, as if it is the last one he will ever see. "My mother says we will have land," he whispers, voice trembling. "A place to live. Do you think it will be better than here?" You look at him, unsure how to answer. "I hope so," you say quietly. The boy nods, but does not seem convinced. A few feet away, Captain Smith speaks with several men from the Virginia Company. They argue in hushed tones about supplies, about the growing sickness on board, about how much longer they can endure before they reach the shores of this so-called New World. Not everyone survives the voyage. The sea claims some, illness takes others. When someone dies, the crew wraps the body in a sheet and slips it into the water with a prayer. The ocean does not pause for grief, but one morning, just as the sun begins to rise, a cry goes up from the crow's nest. "Land. Land ahead." You rush to the rail along with everyone else. Far on the horizon, through the mist, you see it, a thin line of green and brown breaking the endless blue. The excitement on deck is immediate. People cheer, hug, whisper prayers of thanks. The boy with the wooden bowl clutches your sleeve, eyes wide. "We made it," he says softly. The ship steers toward the coast. As the sun climbs higher, you see the shore more clearly. A narrow riverbank lined with towering trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The land looks wild, untamed, beautiful. Captain Smith stands at the bow, his gaze fixed on the river ahead. "This is it," he says quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Virginia." He glances back at you, his eyes sharp but kind, ready to set foot in the new world. Before you can answer, the ship slips quietly into the mouth of a river. The current carries you closer to shore, closer to whatever waits in that thick green forest. You tighten your grip on the railing as the crew prepares to lower the small boats that will take everyone to land. You do not know it yet, but this will be the beginning of something far greater than anyone on this ship can imagine. The first step onto Virginia's wild shores, a fight for survival begins. The small boat rocks hard as it cuts through the river's current, its wooden hull scraping against unseen sandbars beneath the water. You hold the side tight, feeling the chill of the spray on your face. The Susan Constant is anchored behind you now, distant and towering. Ahead lies a narrow strip of muddy shoreline. Behind that, a wall of forest so dense and green it almost looks alive, as though it could swallow the entire party whole. The boat crunches onto the riverbank. Captain John Smith is the first to leap ashore, boots sinking deep into the wet earth. He turns and extends a hand to steady you as you climb out. "Watch your step," he says with a brief grin. This ground is not as forgiving as it looks. The rest of the settlers follow, some carrying crates, others dragging barrels of food and tools. Children stumble over roots and rocks, too tired from the long voyage to even cry. The air is thick and humid, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Insects buzz around your ears. Somewhere in the forest, you hear the distant crack of a branch, and you cannot help but glance into the trees, wondering who or what is watching. "Keep moving," a voice calls. "We need a base camp before nightfall." The shoreline quickly turns into organized chaos. Smith directs men to start clearing brush, while others set up a fire pit near the riverbank. There are arguments about where to build shelter, about how close to the water is safe. One man, older, with sharp features and a voice that carries, mutters loudly enough for everyone to hear, "We should have stayed on the ship. Out here we are exposed." Smith's head snaps around. "We did not cross an ocean to cower on a deck," he says firmly. "This is where we plant roots. We work together, or we fail together. Simple as that." There is no mistaking the tension in the group. You can see it in the way they move, the quick glances at the forest, the quiet conversations about disease, about attacks, about food. The new world looks beautiful. Yes, but also wild, unpredictable, and unforgiving. A boy, no older than the one you spoke with on the ship, trips as he grabs a crate up the hill from the river. You bend down to help him lift it, and he whispers, "Do you think we will really live here? All of us?" You do not answer right away. The truth is, you do not know. By late afternoon, the group has managed to erect the frame of the first crude wooden huts. It is exhausting work. Sweat drips into your eyes as you help hammer rough-hewn planks together with iron nails that feel heavier than your arms can bear. While you work, a few men venture into the forest to scout for game and fresh water. They return with news that there are streams nearby, but also with signs that they are not alone here. Tracks in the dirt, broken branches, a flash of movement in the distance that vanished before anyone could react. One of the scouts leans in close to Smith. "Powhatan," he says in a low voice. "We saw their trails." Smith does not flinch. "Then we will keep watch tonight," he says. "No one leaves the camp alone, not until we know who we are dealing with." The sun dips low behind the trees, and the heat of the day gives way to a damp chill. A fire crackles in the center of camp, its light casting long shadows across the hastily built shelters. People huddle close, whispering prayers under their breath, some silently weeping for the home they left behind. Smith makes the rounds, checking on everyone, offering words of encouragement that are more practical than warm. He stops by where you are sitting, handing you a piece of hard bread. "You look like you could use this," he says. You take it with a grateful nod. "We will get through this," he adds quietly, his eyes scanning the forest beyond the firelight. "We did not come all this way just to turn back." You follow his gaze. Out there, just beyond the glow of the flames, the forest looms dark and silent. You cannot see them, but you can feel it. Someone is watching. Suddenly, a dog begins to bark, its hackles raised. Several men grab their muskets and rush toward the edge of camp, their boots pounding on the packed earth. "Hold your fire!" Smith shouts, but the command is nearly drowned out by the barking. You step closer, a heart pounding, just as a shape emerges from the tree line. For a split second you think it is one of the Powhatan warriors the scouts spoke of, but it is only a deer, startled by the noise, bolting back into the woods. Everyone exhales at once. Nervous laughter ripples through the group, but as you return to your seat by the fire, you cannot shake the feeling that the deer was not the only thing out there. The night closes in around Jamestown, the first English settlement in America, and as you lie awake in the crude shelter you helped build, listening to the restless crackle of the fire and the endless hum of insects, you understand, surviving here will not be easy. The first days of survival in Jamestown, a wild new land, scarce food, and fear in every shadow. Survival begins now. The first night on land is colder than you expected. You lie awake in a crude shelter made from branches and scraps of sailcloth, the ground hard and damp beneath you. Every sound in the darkness feels amplified. The rustle of the river, the distant cry of an animal deep in the woods. It's the soft, steady hum of insects that never seems to stop. It has only been a single day since you and the others stepped off the Susan Constant, but the weight of the new world is already pressing down on you. At dawn, Captain John Smith gathers everyone near the central fire. His coat is still wet from the night's dew, and his jaw is set tight. "We will not survive here if we do not work," he says, his voice cutting through the morning mist. "Every hand will build, plant, and hunt. If you will not work, you will not eat. That is the rule." A few men mutter in protest. One of them, a gentleman who has clearly never done a day of labor in his life, scoffs. "I did not cross an ocean to swing an axe like a commoner." Smith steps forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then you crossed it to starve," he replies sharply. No one argues after that. The hours blur together. You haul logs for new shelters. your shoulders burning with every lift. Others dig shallow pits for cooking fires, chop trees, and try to fashion something that resembles a fort. The air is humid, the mosquitoes relentless. Sweat drips into your eyes as you drive stakes into the ground. When midday comes, there is no feast, only a meager portion of salted pork and hard bread. A woman next to you offers a piece of hers to her young daughter, who takes it silently and chews as if it is a feast. "Do you think we will be safe here?" you ask quietly. The woman shakes her head. "Safe. I do not even know if we will be alive by winter." That night, a group of men venture into the forest to hunt. Only half return. They speak in low voices about arrows in the dark, of shapes moving silently between the trees. No one knows if they were Powhatan warriors or simply the shadows playing tricks. But the fear settles into everyone's bones. Smith does his best to keep order. He stations men at the edge of the camp with muskets and torches, and he walks among the group long after most have fallen asleep, murmuring words of encouragement. But you can see the tension in his shoulders. Days turn into weeks. Water from the river makes many sick, and food grows scarce. People begin to look thinner, weaker. One morning, you wake to find that a man you spoke with the night before has died quietly in his sleep. His friends wrap him in a tattered blanket and bury him just outside the camp without ceremony. There is no time for mourning. Smith's words echo in your mind: work or starve. And yet, even with the fear and exhaustion, you begin to see small signs of hope. New huts take shape, rough but sturdy. The fires burn brighter each night as the settlers gather closer together. Children play in the sand near the river, their laughter a small reminder that life can still be sweet. Even here, one evening, as the sun dips low behind the trees, Smith approaches you while you help repair a broken fence post. "You work hard," he says quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I do not want to starve." You reply with a weak smile. He nods once. "None of us do, but we are learning. We will get through this." You want to believe him. As darkness falls, a loud crack echoes from the forest. The camp goes silent. Muskets are raised. Hearts pound, but nothing emerges from the trees. Not tonight. Meeting Pocahontas, a desperate mission, a captured leader, and an unexpected ally who will change everything. The morning mist clings to the trees like ghostly curtains as Captain John Smith leads a small group into the forest. Supplies are running low, and the camp cannot last without food. You follow, musket in hand, every step careful on the soft earth. The forest is alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves overhead, the distant call of birds, the snap of twigs beneath your boots. Every shadow feels like it is watching. "We have to find the Powhatan villages," Smith whispers to the group. "Trade for corn, for meat, anything. If we do not, we will not survive the winter." Hours pass with no sign of anyone. Then, just as the sun begins to set, the world explodes around you. Arrows whistle through the trees. Men shout. Someone falls hard to the ground beside you, clutching his side. You barely have time to raise your musket before you are surrounded. Dozens of Powhatan warriors step silently out of the shadows, faces painted, bows drawn. There is no chance to fight. One by one, your group is disarmed and bound with strips of rawhide. Smith does not resist. He holds his head high even as his hands are tied. "You will not kill us," he says to the nearest warrior. "Your chief will want to see who we are." He is right. The march to the Powhatan village feels endless. The warriors drive you forward through thickets and across streams, their eyes never leaving you. You glance at Smith, but he is calm, scanning everything around him, already calculating his next move. The village is larger than you imagined. Dozens of thatched huts circle a central fire, where elders sit in quiet conversation. Children pause in their play to stare as you are led into the clearing. At the far end, seated on a carved wooden throne, is Chief Powhatan himself. His gaze is sharp, his expression unreadable. He speaks in a low, measured voice that carries across the clearing. Smith is pushed forward. You watch as he bows slightly, showing respect without weakness. Through an interpreter, he explains why the English have come. They want to build a settlement. They want to trade. Chief Powhatan listens but does not respond. He gestures, and two warriors step forward with heavy clubs. The meaning is clear. Your chest tightens. This is not a negotiation. This is an execution. Smith is forced to the ground, his head placed on a large stone. One of the warriors raises his club high, and then everything changes. A girl rushes forward from the crowd, no older than 13 or 14. Her long black hair falls loose over her shoulders, and her dark eyes flash with determination. She kneels beside Smith, placing her own head over his. The clearing falls silent. Chief Powhatan speaks sharply in his native tongue, his voice edged with anger and confusion. But the girl does not move. Smith glances up at her, stunned. You do not know who she is, but the defiance in her eyes is unmistakable. Finally, Chief Powhatan waves his hand. The warriors lower their clubs. The girl has saved Smith's life. Later, as the warriors cut your bonds, you learn her name, Pocahontas. She speaks softly. In halting English, she has learned from earlier traders. Go, she tells Smith. Take your people. Do not come back here with fear. We do not want war. Smith meets her gaze. We do not want war either, he says. When you're escorted back to Jamestown, the settlement is still buzzing with fear and exhaustion. But for the first time in weeks, there is a glimmer of hope. Because Pocahontas did not just save John Smith's life, she may have given Jamestown a chance to survive. The starving time. Winter closes in, storerooms run empty, and hope begins to slip through frozen fingers. Winter in Jamestown did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like a thief testing the lock on a door. First came the cold mornings, the mist rising off the river as if the land itself was sighing. Then came the icy rain, soaking through the settlers' worn clothes, chilling them to the bone. And finally, the true cold, the kind that turned the river into solid sheets of ice and froze water barrels inside the palisade. The settlement was already weak from months of struggle, but when winter took hold, it was like a final blow. The storerooms were empty. By December, you could see the fear in everyone's eyes. The meager corn that Powhatan had traded earlier in the year was gone. The salted pork brought from England had long since spoiled. Hunting parties trudged back from the forest with nothing but empty hands and haunted faces. Even the animals seemed to have vanished, as if they too sensed death closing in. Captain John Smith did everything he could to maintain order. He gathered everyone in the center of the fort, his breath visible in the icy air as he addressed the crowd. We ration what we have left, he said, holding up a sack that barely filled his arms. If you do not work, you do not eat. That is the law. We survive together, or we do not survive at all. Some nodded. Others stared at the ground. There were whispers that the Powhatan were watching from the trees, waiting for the English to grow weaker. January was worse, every day. Someone died. Burials became quick. Silent affairs. The ground was too hard to dig deep, so the dead were laid to rest in shallow graves just beyond the palisade. Hymns were no longer sung. There was no energy for it. Food was whatever could be found. People boiled roots, pine needles, and anything remotely edible. Tree bark was stripped away until the fort's surroundings looked like a ring of lifeless poles. Leather shoes and belts were boiled into thin, bitter soup. You remember the taste. It is something you will never forget. Inside the huts, the smell of sickness hung thick. Coughing echoed through the settlement at all hours. The small supply of herbs and salves brought from England had been used up weeks ago. The surgeon did what he could. But without proper tools or medicine, most who fell ill never recovered. One night, you woke to the sound of quiet sobbing. A man sat in the corner of the hut, holding his wife's lifeless body. He did not move when others came to take her for burial. He just sat there, staring at the wall, as though he had already joined her. The following morning, there was no bread to distribute. There was nothing. The mood in Jamestown turned darker with each passing day. Desperation brought whispers, rumors of settlers resorting to unthinkable acts to survive. You tried not to listen, but at night, lying awake on the frozen ground, the whispers clung to you like the cold. Even John Smith was not invincible. In late February, an accident with gunpowder left him badly burned. You remember the blast, the smell of scorched wood and flesh, and the panicked shouts as the fire was smothered. Smith's face was pale with pain as the surgeon dressed his wounds with strips of rough cloth. I have to return to England, Smith admitted quietly, barely audible over the wind. If I stay here, I will not live. His departure was like the final thread snapping. By March, the settlement was a shell of what it had been. Less than 1/3 of the original settlers remained. Faces were hollow, eyes sunken, clothes hanging loose on frail bodies. Children were silent now, their laughter a memory you could barely recall. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, you sat by the dying embers of the central fire. A young girl, no more than 8 years old, approached. She was clutching an empty wooden bowl in her small hands. "Will we all die here?" she asked softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. You could not answer. But then, just as the last traces of hope began to fade, salvation appeared. It was early April when a ship appeared on the river, its white sails glowing like a beacon in the spring sunlight. At first, you thought it was a dream, a cruel trick of hunger and exhaustion. But the ship's bell rang clear, real, and the settlers stumbled toward the shoreline in disbelief. Supplies, crates of flour and salted meat, seeds for planting, tools, medicine, warm clothes, everything you had been praying for. You held a loaf of bread in your hands and felt its warmth seep into your frozen fingers. Around you, survivors wept openly, clutching each other as though afraid they might disappear. Fewer than 60 people remained, but Jamestown was alive. The starving time was over, and though the colony would recover, you knew this winter would haunt you for the rest of your life. John Rolfe and tobacco, a single plant, a bold idea, and the crop that would change Jamestown's fate forever. The months following the starving time felt like waking from a nightmare. The arrival of the supply ship had saved Jamestown from certain collapse, but it had not erased the scars left behind. The survivors, fewer than 60 of you, moved slowly through the settlement, rebuilding what was left. Many were too weak to work for long, their bodies still frail from hunger. Yet, there was a quiet determination in every step. You had survived the worst, and now, somehow, you had to begin again. It was during this fragile time that a man named John Rolfe arrived. He was not like most of the settlers you had met before. Rolfe carried himself with a calm confidence, his clothes neat, his boots polished even after weeks at sea. But what struck you most was the small wooden crate he guarded carefully during the entire voyage. Inside were seeds. Not just any seeds, tobacco seeds from the Spanish Caribbean. Rolfe believed this crop could save the colony. He had studied the land around Jamestown, noticed the rich, sandy soil along the banks of the James River. If he could grow tobacco here, he said, the colony might finally have something England wanted badly enough to keep supporting. At first, many were skeptical. "We need food, not fancy leaves to burn," one man scoffed as Rolfe explained his plan. But Rolfe was determined. He cleared a plot of land by the river with his own hands, digging deep furrows in the earth, carefully planting each seed. You watched him work day after day. The labor was backbreaking, but Rolfe never complained. "This crop could change everything," he said quietly one evening, wiping the sweat from his brow. Weeks passed. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, growing taller and stronger under the Virginia sun. The plants were delicate at first, easily damaged by insects and storms, but Rolfe tended to them like a man tending to hope itself. By midsummer, the tobacco plants stood waist-high, their broad leaves glistening in the humid air. The scent was sharp and sweet, unlike anything you had ever smelled. Rolfe's success brought a shift in the colony's spirit. The settlers, once focused only on survival, now began to see a future. They helped him expand the fields, planting more rows of tobacco along the riverbank. Children ran between the furrows, their laughter mixing with the sound of hoes breaking the earth. But tobacco was not just a crop, it was hard currency. When the first shipment of dried leaves was sent back to England, the response was immediate. Merchants clamored for more, demand soared. Jamestown, once on the edge of extinction, now had a product that could support its people and attract new settlers. With the fields growing larger, Rolfe knew the colony needed a stronger foundation. He proposed more structured laws, organized work schedules, and equal rations. He also pushed for new homes and warehouses, believing Jamestown should not just survive, but thrive. You found yourself working long days in the fields, your hands stained from the sticky resin of the plants. It was hard work, but it felt different from before. There was purpose now, not just desperation. In the evenings, Rolfe often spoke about the future. "Tobacco will make Virginia stand on its own," he said one night as the firelight flickered across his face. "But it must be more than that. We must build a society here, not just a field of crops." His words carried weight, but you could sense the challenges ahead. The Powhatan were wary of the colony's growing strength, and tensions simmered quietly. There were also questions about who would work the fields as demand increased. Yet for now, there was hope. Rolf's crop had transformed Jamestown's fortune. Ships began to arrive more frequently, bringing tools, supplies, and new settlers. Houses were rebuilt stronger. The fort expanded. One morning, you stood on the riverbank and watched as another cargo ship loaded with tobacco sailed toward the horizon. The air was warm, the scent of drying leaves heavy in the breeze. Jamestown was no longer just clinging to survival. It was beginning to prosper. And though you knew the road ahead would not be easy, you could not help but feel a spark of pride as you looked at the green fields stretching as far as the eye could see, because of a single plant. Jamestown had a future, the marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas, a union of two worlds, a fragile peace, and a love story that would echo through history. The fields of tobacco stretched green and wide along the James River, a sign that Jamestown had not only survived but begun to prosper. Yet, beneath the colony's new success, tension still lingered with the Powhatan. Trade was fragile, trust even more so. It was during this uneasy time that Pocahontas returned to Jamestown. You remembered her clearly, the young girl who had once saved Captain John Smith's life. She was older now, poised, her dark hair neatly tied back, but her presence still carried the same quiet strength you had seen in the Powhatan village years before. She'd been living under the care of the English for some time, learning their language and customs. Some settlers whispered that she had been captured during a skirmish, others that she had come willingly. Whatever the truth, Pocahontas seemed determined to bridge the divide between her people and the colonists. And then there was John Rolfe. You had watched the bond between Rolfe and Pocahontas grow quietly over the months. At first, it was conversation Rolfe teaching her how tobacco was cultivated, Pocahontas sharing the ways her people cared for the land. Soon, it was more. You saw it in the way Rolfe's eyes softened when she approached, in the small smile she gave only him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, Rolfe gathered a small group of settlers by the central fire. His voice was steady but earnest. "I wish to marry Pocahontas," he announced. There was silence. Some were surprised, others uneasy. A union between an Englishman and the daughter of Chief Powhatan was unprecedented. "Do you believe the chief will accept this?" One man asked cautiously. Rolfe nodded. "I believe it may bring peace. And I will not pretend it is only for politics. I love her." The wedding took place in April of 1614 in a small wooden church in Jamestown. You were there, seated on one of the rough-hewn benches, the scent of pine from the fresh timber walls filling the air. Pocahontas entered quietly, wearing a simple linen gown gifted by the English. Her hair was adorned with white beads, and around her neck hung a small copper cross. Rolfe stood at the altar, his hands clasped, his expression soft as he watched her approach. The ceremony was not elaborate, but it was filled with a sense of hope. As the minister spoke the vows, you glanced around at the gathered settlers and Powhatan who had been permitted to attend. For a brief moment, the tension between the two worlds seemed to ease. When Rolfe and Pocahontas exchanged rings, the church filled with a murmur of approval. You felt a weight lift from the colony, as if this union might truly heal the rift that had caused so much suffering. Afterward, there was a modest feast outside the church. Settlers and Powhatan shared bread, roasted venison, and fresh berries. Children played together near the riverbank, their laughter carrying over the water. Chief Powhatan himself did not attend, but he sent gifts, baskets of corn, finely woven mats, and a carved bow for Rolfe. It was a gesture of acceptance, though you could not help but wonder how long the peace would last. Pocahontas smiled often that day, though you could see a flicker of sadness in her eyes when no one was looking. She had left much behind: her family, her village, the life she had known to take this step. Rolfe seemed to understand. That night, as the celebrations faded, you saw him standing with her beneath the stars, speaking softly, promising that their life together would be one of respect and partnership. In the weeks that followed, the marriage did bring a period of calm. Trade with the Powhatan improved, and attacks on the colony ceased. The settlers began to build new homes, plant larger fields, and speak more confidently about the future. For the first time, you felt as though Jamestown might truly endure, but you also sensed how fragile this peace was. You could feel it in the way some settlers still looked at the Powhatan with suspicion, in the whispers among the warriors who visited the colony that they feared losing their land. Yet, for now, there was a kind of harmony. One evening, as you watched Rolf and Pocahontas walk through the tobacco fields hand in hand, you thought of the first time you had seen him stepping forward in a Powhatan village to save John Smith. This union was more than just marriage. It was a bridge between two worlds, and you could only hope it would hold. The Powhatan culture, a journey beyond the palisade into a world few settlers ever truly understood. The marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas had brought a rare calm to Jamestown. Trade with the Powhatan increased, and for the first time in years, the threat of raids seemed to fade. Yet, there was still a wall between the settlers and the people whose lands they now occupied, a wall of language, customs, and deep mistrust. One day, you found yourself stepping beyond that wall. It began with an invitation. Pocahontas had spoken with her uncle, Opachankana, a respected Powhatan leader, about allowing a few settlers to visit one of their villages. She believed that the more the two peoples understood each other, the stronger the peace would be. You were one of those chosen. The journey took hours, following a narrow trail that wound through towering pines and dense undergrowth. You were guided by two Powhatan men, their movements silent and sure-footed, as if the forest itself parted for them. When the village finally came into view, it was unlike anything you had imagined. Dozens of long, rounded houses, yahakins, they were called, stood in a broad clearing. Each was made from bent saplings covered in woven mats and bark, warm and sturdy against the elements. Smoke curled from small openings at the tops, carrying the scent of roasting meat and sweet corn. Children ran barefoot across the packed earth, their laughter echoing through the trees. Women worked nearby, tending fires, grinding corn into meal with smooth stone mortars, and weaving baskets from river reeds. Warriors moved through the clearing with quiet purpose, their faces marked with patterns of red and black paint. Your arrival drew curious eyes. Some villagers greeted you with cautious nods, others avoided your gaze, but no one spoke until an elder woman approached. Her hair was streaked with silver, and she carried a staff decorated with feathers. She placed a hand over her heart, then gestured toward the center of the village. "This is their welcome," Pocahontas whispered at their side. "Follow her." You were led to a fire where several elders sat in a circle. A large clay pot simmered over the flames, filling the air with the rich aroma of stewed venison and beans. One elder spoke in Powhatan, his voice low and rhythmic. Pocahontas translated. "He says you are guests here. You must eat with them, share their food, if you wish to be part of the peace." You nodded and accepted a wooden bowl of stew. The taste was earthy and warm, a comfort you had not expected. Around the fire, conversations flowed in a language you could not understand, yet you felt the weight of their eyes on you. After the meal, you were shown more of the village. You watched as the women shaped clay pots with careful hands, smoothing the edges with river stones. You saw young boys learning to shoot arrows at targets carved from logs, their laughter breaking into cheers when they struck true. One elder took you to the edge of the forest, pointing out medicinal plants growing in the shade. Through Pocahontas, he explained how the Powhatan used willow bark to ease pain, crushed mint leaves to treat fevers, and pine resin to seal wounds. You realized how much knowledge these people had, knowledge that had kept them alive for generations, but you also saw the strain. The Powhatan knew their world was changing. More ships arrived from England each year, bringing more settlers who needed land and food. Even now, you could feel the unease in the way some warriors watched you, their hands resting lightly on their bows. That night, the Powhatan held a dance to honor their visitors. Drums echoed through the clearing as men and women circled the fire, their feet pounding the earth in unison. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar, and the rhythmic chanting seemed to rise into the stars themselves. Pocahontas joined the dance, her movements graceful and sure. You stood at the edge, feeling like an outsider, yet strangely moved by the sight. Opachankana approached you as the dance ended. He studied you for a long moment before speaking through Pocahontas. "You are here because of her," he said, nodding toward his niece. "We honor the peace she has made. But remember this, our patience is not endless. The land feeds us as it feeds you. If you take too much, there will be no peace." His words stayed with you as you returned to Jamestown the next morning. The visit had shown you a world few settlers ever saw, a world of community, tradition, and deep respect for the land. But it had also revealed how fragile the peace truly was. As you crossed back through the gates of the fort, you could not help but wonder how long that fragile balance would last. Because the Powhatan were not a people who would disappear quietly. The Pilgrims and the Mayflower, a new ship, a new group of settlers, and a dangerous journey in search of freedom. The story shifts now, far from the tobacco fields of Virginia to a cold, windswept port on the edge of England. It is the summer of 1620, and a small group of men, women, and children huddle on a wooden dock in the grey morning light. They are not wealthy, nor are they driven by the lure of profit. They are pilgrims, English separatists, seeking a place where they can worship freely, away from the strict rule of the Church of England. You stand among them, your breath misting in the chilly air. Around you, families cling tightly together, whispering prayers, clutching worn Bibles. Their possessions fit into a handful of trunks and sacks. Everything they own reduced to what can be carried aboard a single ship. The ship's name is painted boldly on its stern, the Mayflower. It is not a grand vessel, barely 100 feet long. It was built to carry cargo, not people. Yet today, it will carry 102 souls across the vast Atlantic Ocean. The journey is risky. Everyone knows it. Storms, disease, and starvation have claimed countless lives on voyages like this. But the Pilgrims believe their mission is worth the danger. We will build a new life, one man says quietly, his hand resting on the shoulder of his young son. A place where we are free to believe as we choose. The ship creaks and groans as the crew makes final preparations. You are ushered aboard, ducking through the narrow doorway into the dark, crowded lower deck. There is little space to move. Families stake out corners with blankets and barrels, doing their best to create some semblance of privacy. The air is thick with the smell of tar, salt, and fear. The Mayflower leaves port in September. At first, the seas are calm, and there is a quiet optimism among the passengers. But soon, the weather turns. The ship is tossed by brutal autumn storms. Waves slam against the hull, sending icy spray through every crack in the timbers. The lower deck is a nightmare dark, wet and foul-smelling. Seasick passengers retch into buckets, which must be carried up the slick stairs and emptied overboard. Food is rationed carefully. Hardtack biscuits so tough they can break teeth. Dried meat, a thin beer brewed to keep the water from spoiling. Fresh vegetables disappear within weeks, and scurvy begins to take hold. One by one, passengers fall ill. You help carry a young woman to the deck for fresh air, but she is already too weak to stand. The next morning, her body is sewn into a canvas shroud and slid into the sea. The captain murmuring a prayer as the waves swallow her. The deaths weigh heavily on everyone, but the Pilgrims cling to their faith. Each night, they gather in hushed circles, singing psalms that mingle with the howling wind. By November, the Mayflower has been at sea for more than 60 days. Supplies are nearly gone, and tempers run high. Then, one grey morning, a shout erupts from the lookout at the top of the main mast. Land. Land ahead. You scramble to the rail with everyone else, and there it is. A jagged coastline rising out of the mist, crowned with dark, wind-blown pines. It is not Virginia, where the ship had intended to land. Strong storms have blown the Mayflower far north, to a place called Cape Cod, but it does not matter. You have reached the New World. The Pilgrims drop anchor in the sheltered waters of Provincetown Harbour. Yet even here, there is uncertainty. The land is unfamiliar, and there is no one to greet you. Before anyone sets foot ashore, the group gathers in the ship's cabin to sign an agreement, the Mayflower Compact. It is a simple document, pledging to create a civil body politic, to make laws and decisions for the good of the colony. You sign your name alongside the others. This is not England. There will be no king here. As you step off the Mayflower and onto the sandy shore of Cape Cod, the air feels sharper, colder. Behind you, the ship rocks gently in the harbour, the only home you have known for months. Ahead lies a wilderness that is vast, empty, and utterly unknown. The Pilgrims kneel and pray, their voices carried away by the wind. This place is not the destination they planned, but it will become the beginning of something greater than any of them can imagine. Plymouth and the Mayflower Compact, a bitter winter, a fragile agreement, and the first steps of a new colony. The air on Cape Cod was colder than you could have imagined. It bit at your cheeks and made every breath sting in your lungs. The Mayflower lay anchored behind you in the grey harbour, its tattered sails flapping weakly in the wind. But there was no turning back now. You had signed the Mayflower Compact, a single sheet of parchment, written quickly in the cramped cabin of the ship, yet it carried the weight of a promise. For the general good of the colony, it said. You remembered how quiet the cabin had been as each man stepped forward, pen scratching against the rough paper. There was no king here, no distant government. If the Pilgrims were to survive, they would govern themselves, bound together by faith and necessity. Now it was time to build that future. The shoreline was bleak, the ground frozen solid beneath a thin crust of snow. The forest loomed behind the beach, a wall of bare trees that swayed and whispered in the wind. You could almost feel unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Small parties ventured inland, searching for a place to settle. They found abandoned native villages, their fields empty and overgrown. Signs of life were everywhere: broken tools, empty corn caches, footprints in the snow, but the people themselves were gone, likely lost to disease. Finally, the group chose a site on a sheltered harbour with a small brook nearby. They called it Plymouth, after the port in England where their journey had begun. The work began immediately. You helped fell trees, swinging an axe until your arms ached and your hands blistered. Others dug into the frozen ground, building crude shelters of wood and thatch. The wind never stopped. It blew through the gaps in the walls at night, carrying the bitter scent of salt and pine. Food was scarce. What little remained from the ship's stores was rationed carefully. A handful of cornmeal, a strip of dried meat, a cup of thin beer. By mid-December, the first deaths came. Illness spread quickly in the cold. Damp shelters, one by one. People grew weak with fever and cough. You spent nights sitting by the sick, pressing a damp cloth to their foreheads, whispering prayers they were too weak to say themselves. There were days when you buried 2 or 3 at a time. The grave shallow because the ground was too hard to dig deep. There were no funerals, only whispered goodbyes as the snow covered the fresh mounds. You began to wonder if the journey had been worth it. Yet, even in the midst of grief, there were small moments of hope. One morning, you woke to see a line of footprints leading from the forest to the edge of the settlement. Whoever had come left no message, no sign of who they were. But the next day, more footprints appeared, and a small bundle of dried fish lay at the edge of the clearing. Someone was watching everywhere. The Pilgrims held fast to their faith. Each night, they gathered in the largest of the half-finished houses to sing psalms, their voices rising softly into the cold air. When the worst of the winter finally began to break, barely half the original passengers of the Mayflower were left alive. But Plymouth endured, and with the arrival of spring, so too did hope. One bright morning, a tall figure stepped out of the forest and walked boldly into the center of the settlement. He wore buckskins and carried a bow, but he did not raise it. In clear, accented English, he said, "Welcome, Englishmen." The Pilgrims stared in shock. This man was Samoset, a member of the Wabanaki people. He had learned English from fishermen along the coast. Samoset explained that the land where the Pilgrims now lived had once belonged to the Patuxet tribe, but they had been wiped out by disease years before. He promised to return with someone who could help them, and he did. A week later, Samoset brought another native man named Squanto. Squanto spoke English even better than Samoset. He had once been captured by traders and taken to Europe, only to escape and return home. He understood the Pilgrims' world as few others could, and he offered to teach them how to survive in his. How to plant corn with fish for fertilizer, how to find edible plants in the forest, how to catch eels in the streams, and fish in the shallow bays. With Squanto's guidance, Plymouth began to thrive as you knelt in the newly tilled earth, planting seeds in the warming spring soil. You could not help but think back to the frozen winter nights when you doubted you would live to see this day. The Mayflower had sailed back to England, but you and the others remained. The compact you signed still held you together, a fragile agreement born of desperation but strengthened by faith. And now, with the help of your native neighbours, the colony finally had a chance. The first winter in Plymouth. Bitter cold, empty tables, and a colony fighting to survive its first winter. The first winter in Plymouth was unlike anything you had ever known. The wind came off the Atlantic in great howling gusts, shaking the half-finished houses and slipping through every gap in the walls. At night, it whistled through the trees like a ghostly warning. The shelters were small and crude, built from green wood that cracked and shrank as it dried. You huddled under thin blankets with the others, sharing body heat to stay alive. When the fire burned low, you woke with a start, your breath a white mist in the darkness. Food was scarce. The cornmeal brought from the Mayflower was nearly gone, and the little they had managed to scavenge from abandoned native villages had been stretched to the breaking point. Some nights there was nothing to eat at all. You remember sitting around the fire with a small group, passing a single piece of hard bread from hand to hand, each person breaking off the tiniest bite so that everyone could taste something. Illness came quickly. The cold and damp made lungs weak, and fevers burned through the cramped shelters. You spent nights kneeling beside the sick, wiping sweat from their foreheads, trying to soothe their labored breathing. Some survived, many did not. The burials were quiet, held at night so that nearby native tribes would not see how few remained. Graves were dug in frozen soil by the light of the moon, the muffled thud of shovels, the only sound. You had stopped counting the dead after the first month. There were moments you questioned why you had ever come. The New World had promised freedom and opportunity, but now it felt like a sentence, and yet there were small glimmers of hope. One day, as you trudged back from gathering firewood, you saw a bundle lying at the edge of the clearing. Inside were dried fish and a small bag of corn. There was no note, but you knew it was a gift. Someone was watching over you. When spring finally came, it felt like the entire world exhaled. The snow melted, revealing patches of dark, damp earth. Streams once frozen solid now trickled with fresh water. Birds returned to the forest, their songs a sound you had almost forgotten. And then the visitors arrived. One bright morning, a tall man stepped confidently out of the forest and walked straight into the heart of the settlement. He wore deerskin clothing and carried a bow, but his hands were empty. In clear, accented English, he said, "Welcome." Englishman, his name was Samoset, and he belonged to the Wabanaki people. He had learned English from fishermen along the coast, and he was curious about the strange newcomers who had built their homes on this land. Samoset stayed for only a short time, but he promised to return with someone who could help, and he did. A week later, he brought a man named Squanto. Squanto spoke English fluently, his voice steady and kind. He told you his story, how he had once been captured by English traders and taken to Europe, how he had escaped and found his way home, only to discover that his entire tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by disease. Now, he would help the pilgrims survive. He taught you how to plant corn with fish buried beneath the soil as fertilizer. He showed you which plants could heal wounds and which ones could kill you. He took you to the streams and taught you how to catch eels with your bare hands, laughing when you slipped on the muddy banks. With Squanto's guidance, Plymouth began to change. Fields were planted, homes rebuilt stronger and warmer. The survivors, though fewer than half the original group, found new strength in the work. One evening, as you stood on a hill overlooking the small cluster of houses, you felt something you had not felt in months. Hope. You knew the road ahead would not be easy. The land was still harsh, and the peace with the native tribes was fragile. But you also knew that the worst of the first winter was behind you. And for the first time since stepping off the Mayflower, you allowed yourself to believe that Plymouth might endure. Meeting Squanto, a man who understood two worlds, and the ally who would help Plymouth survive. The spring sun was warm on your shoulders as you worked in the fields, digging shallow furrows into the damp earth. For the first time since stepping off the Mayflower, the air smelled of life rather than death. But Plymouth was still fragile. Half the settlers had died during the first winter. Those who remained were gaunt and weary, their clothes tattered from months of hard living. The new houses were stronger now, but the memories of cold nights and empty bellies were still fresh. That was when he arrived. Squanto. You'd seen him once before, when Samoset brought him to the settlement. But now, he had returned on his own, walking calmly into the clearing, as though he had always belonged there. He was unlike anyone you had ever met. His English was fluent, clear and confident, but his manner carried the quiet authority of someone deeply rooted in the land. He greeted Governor Bradford and the other leaders with a polite nod, then turned his dark, steady gaze on the rest of you. "I will help you," he said simply, and he did. Squanto's knowledge of the land was extraordinary. He taught you how to plant corn the way the Patuxet had always done, digging holes in the earth, placing a fish in each one, and covering it with soil before planting the seeds. The fish would feed the corn as it grew, ensuring a strong harvest. You remember kneeling in the dirt as Squanto guided your hands, showing you the depth of each hole, the placement of each seed. "This way," he said quietly. "The earth gives back what we take." But his lessons went far beyond farming. He showed you which berries and roots were safe to eat and which would kill you. He taught you how to find edible clams in the tidal flats and how to trap eels in the streams using woven baskets. When a child in the colony fell ill with a fever, Squanto gathered herbs from the forest, brewing a bitter tea that eased the boy's breathing and saved his life. And he did more than just teach. Squanto acted as a bridge between the pilgrims and the native tribes of the region. He spoke with Massasoit, the powerful leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, persuading him to sign a peace treaty with Plymouth. The treaty was simple. The Pilgrims and Wampanoag would not harm each other. They would trade, help each other in times of need, and stand together if attacked by enemies. It was a fragile peace, but it was enough. For the first time, you felt as though Plymouth might truly have a future. There were moments when Squanto shared stories of his own past, though you could see the pain in his eyes as he spoke. He had once been taken from his homeland by English traders, sold into slavery in Spain, and later escaped to England. By the time he returned to Massachusetts, his entire tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by disease. He was the last of his people. You could see the weight of that truth in the way he looked at the land, the forests and rivers that had once been filled with his family's laughter. One evening, after a long day of planting, you found Squanto standing at the edge of the fields, staring into the distance. "Does it ever feel like too much?" you asked softly. He glanced at you, then nodded. "Yes, but helping you, it gives me purpose. Perhaps my people's knowledge can live on through you." You were quiet for a long moment, humbled by his words. As the weeks passed, the fields of Plymouth began to change. Rows of young corn plants sprouted, their green leaves reaching toward the sun. Children ran through the village with full bellies and laughter in their voices again. The settlers rebuilt their lives piece by piece, always aware that it would not have been possible without Squanto. One day, as you worked beside him in the fields, you asked, "Do you think we will survive here?" He smiled faintly. "If you remember that this land is alive, and you are only a part of it, yes, you will survive." That night, as you stood by the central fire, listening to the crackle of flames and the quiet hum of the forest beyond, you felt something you had not felt in many months. Gratitude for the land, for the people who had helped you, and for the man who had given Plymouth the knowledge and the peace it needed to endure. Because without Squanto, you knew the story of the Pilgrims might have ended long ago. The first harvest and Thanksgiving, a season of abundance, a fragile peace, and a feast that would echo through centuries. The fields of Plymouth glowed gold under the autumn sun. Rows of corn, squash, and beans stood ready for harvest, the fruit of months of hard work and the knowledge Squanto had so generously shared. For the first time, the settlers could look at the land and see life, not hardship. The children ran laughing through the fields, their bare feet scattering dry leaves as the adults cut stalks and gathered baskets heavy with food. The sharp scent of fresh earth and ripened corn filled the air. Mingled with the distant tang of the sea, it was hard to believe how close the colony had come to collapse only months before. But now, the storerooms were full. Fresh vegetables were stacked alongside smoked fish, salted venison, and barrels of grain. The sight of such abundance brought tears to more than one face. Governor William Bradford knew what this moment meant. "We will celebrate," he declared, his voice steady. "We will thank God for his mercy, and we will thank those who helped us reach this day." And so the plan for a great feast began. Messengers were sent to Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, inviting him and his people to join in the celebration. It was a bold gesture, but the Treaty of Peace still held, and Bradford knew that showing unity was vital for Plymouth's future. The Wampanoag arrived 3 days later, Massasoit himself, along with 90 of his warriors, their faces marked with bright patterns of red and black paint. They brought with them baskets of corn, nuts, and dried fruit, as well as several deer they had hunted for the occasion. The feast lasted 3 days. Tables were built from rough-hewn planks, covered with baskets and platters of food. There was roasted duck, goose, and venison. There was cornmeal pudding sweetened with honey, and bread made from the fresh grain harvested from the fields. The pilgrims shared what they had learned to prepare, and the Wampanoag taught them new ways to cook with native herbs and roots. You remember sitting by the fire with a plate in your lap, the warmth of the flames mixing with the smell of roasted meat, and the sound of laughter in the cool evening air. It was not just a meal. It was a moment of gratitude for the harvest, for survival, and for the unlikely friendships that had made both possible. Squanto sat near you, quietly watching the celebration. He rarely spoke of his past, but you could see the shadow of it in his eyes. The knowledge that his own Patuxet people would never gather like this again. "Do you think this peace will last?" you asked him softly. He was silent for a long moment before replying. "Peace is like this fire," he said, gesturing to the glowing embers. "It will last only if you feed it." You understood what he meant. For now, though, the fire burned brightly. Children from Plymouth and the Wampanoag played together near the edge of the clearing, chasing each other through the fallen leaves. The adults shared stories, songs, and even contests of strength and skill. At one point, Massasoit rose and addressed the crowd. "We have eaten together," he said through an interpreter. "We have shared the work of the earth. May we continue to stand together, for this land is wide enough for all who respect it." The pilgrims nodded solemnly. You could feel the weight of his words. As the sun set on the final day of the feast, you looked around at the small community that had grown from the ashes of so much suffering. You saw children with full bellies, fields heavy with crops, and neighbors who were no longer strangers. You thought of the first winter the graves dug in frozen soil, the nights spent shivering in the dark, and felt a swell of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. This harvest was not just food, it was hope. And the feast you shared with the Wampanoag was not just a celebration, it was a promise that Plymouth might endure, a promise that perhaps this fragile peace could hold. The fire crackled as the stars emerged one by one in the clear autumn sky. You closed your eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks, as you knew how close you had come to losing everything. The growing colonies, new ships, new settlers, and a land that was beginning to change forever. The years after the first Thanksgiving brought change to Plymouth and beyond. More ships began to cross the Atlantic, their white sails appearing on the horizon like ghosts. Each carried settlers hungry for a new life, but also fearful of the unknown. They brought tools, livestock, and seeds, but also illness, ambition, and the certainty that this land could be theirs if they worked hard enough. Plymouth was no longer the lonely outpost it had once been. New houses were built, sturdier than before, with thick timber walls and stone fireplaces. The fields expanded, stretching further from the central core. What had once been a tiny village was slowly becoming a true colony. But Plymouth was not the only settlement anymore. To the south, the colony of Massachusetts Bay was taking shape. Founded by Puritans seeking their own religious freedom, they arrived in numbers far greater than the Pilgrims had ever imagined whole families. Dozens of them, disembarking from well-supplied ships. The sight of so many new faces filled some with hope, others with worry. This land will not stretch forever. One elder murmured as he watched the new settlers drive stakes into the ground for their homes. You understood his fear. The arrival of each ship meant more mouths to feed, more fields to plant, and more land needed for expansion. And it also meant more contact with the native tribes whose ancestors had lived here for generations. At first, there was trade. Furs, corn, and game were exchanged for tools, blankets, and metal goods. But misunderstandings arose quickly. Disputes over hunting grounds, over property lines, over whether land could even be owned at all. You remembered Massasoit's words at the first Thanksgiving. This land is wide enough for all who respect it. But as the colonies grew, that balance became harder to keep. Still, there was a sense of opportunity everywhere. Ships from England brought goods that once seemed impossible to find. Fine cloth, books, even barrels of wine. Streets were laid out in neat rows, with meeting houses and marketplaces at their centres. Children who had once shivered through that first winter in Plymouth now ran through the village laughing, carrying baskets of fresh bread. Yet the world beyond the palisade remained dangerous. The winters were still brutal, and crops could fail in a single storm. Wolves prowled the forests at night, their howls echoing through the trees. And tensions with some of the native tribes were beginning to flare. One evening, as you stood on the edge of the fields, watching the sun dip behind distant hills, you thought about how quickly everything had changed. When you had first stepped off the Mayflower, Plymouth had been a desperate outpost, a handful of half-starved settlers clinging to survival. Now, there were multiple colonies up and down the coast, each growing larger by the month, and each carrying with it the same hope and the same risks. You wondered what the future would hold. Would the colonies stand together, or would they turn against each other? Would the fragile peace with the native tribes endure, or would it fracture under the weight of expansion? There were no answers yet. But as you returned to the warm glow of the village that night, the sound of children's laughter carrying on the crisp air, you felt a cautious optimism. The colonies were growing, and though you knew there would be hardships ahead, you could not help but believe that something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. Colonial life, daily struggles, quiet joys, and the rhythm of life in the American colonies. Life in the colonies was rarely easy, but it carried a rhythm that soon became familiar. Each day began at first light. Roosters crowed as the sun crept above the treetops, casting long shadows across the fields. Men rose from their straw-filled mattresses to tend to livestock feeding pits, milking cows, and checking the wooden fences that kept wolves and foxes at bay. Women stoked the fires, their hands red and cracked from years of work. Bread dough was kneaded and set to rise, and porridge simmered in heavy iron pots. Children rubbed the sleep from their eyes as they were handed chores, gathering eggs, carrying water from the well, sweeping the dirt floors of their homes. The houses were simple, usually 1 or 2 rooms with low ceilings and small windows. They were built from timber cut in the surrounding forests, their decks filled with clay and straw. In winter, the wind still found its way inside, and the family huddled close to the hearth for warmth. Food was never wasted. Colonists relied heavily on what they could grow themselves: corn, beans, and squash, supplemented by hunting and fishing when possible. Every part of an animal was used. Meat was salted and smoked to last through the long winters, and hides were tanned to make clothing and shoes. Sundays were different. On the Sabbath, the village came alive in its own quiet way. Bells rang from the small meeting house at the center of town, calling everyone to worship, families dressed in their cleanest clothes, often the only set they owned that was not patched and mended. The service could last for hours, the minister's voice carrying through the drafty room as he spoke about faith and perseverance. Children fidgeted on the hard wooden benches, but they knew better than to complain. Schooling, when it was available, was simple and practical. Older boys often apprenticed with blacksmiths, carpenters, or shipbuilders, learning trades that would serve them for life. Girls were taught sewing, spinning, and how to manage a household. Literacy was valued, especially the ability to read the Bible, but many children's education was cut short by the demands of survival. Colonial life was not without danger. Illness could sweep through a settlement in a matter of weeks. Smallpox, dysentery, and fevers claimed lives young and old. Medicine was rudimentary, at best herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayer. There was also the constant threat of conflict. As the colonies expanded, they often clashed with native tribes whose lands they were occupying. Some communities lived in relative peace through trade and treaties, while others experienced devastating attacks. Militia drills became a part of life. Every able-bodied man expected to know how to defend the settlement if needed. Yet, there was joy as well. Barn raisings and harvest festivals brought neighbors together to work, eat, and celebrate. Weddings were community affairs with music, dancing, and tables filled with pies and roasted meats. Children played games with hoops and marbles, their laughter ringing through the dusty streets. One autumn evening, you stood outside your home, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Behind you, the smell of apple pies cooling on the windowsill filled the air. You thought of how far the colonies had come, from the desperate days of Plymouth's first winter to the bustling villages that now dotted the coastline. Life had changed. It was still hard, still uncertain, but there was a growing sense of permanence. The colonies were no longer just temporary outposts. They were becoming home, and even as you looked toward the distant horizon, wondering what challenges the future might bring, you felt a deep connection to this land, the rivers, the forests, the open fields, because this was no longer just survival. This was the beginning of a nation, the road to independence, taxes, protests, and a growing belief that the colonies could stand on their own. By the mid-1700s, life in the American colonies had become more stable. Towns and farms stretched across the landscape from New England down to Georgia, bustling with markets, schools, and churches. The colonies were thriving, but the relationship with England was beginning to strain. At first, it was small things. New taxes on goods like sugar, paper, and tea. The British government argued these taxes were fair after all. England had spent a fortune defending the colonies during the French and Indian War, but many colonists saw it differently. Why should we pay taxes to a government 3,000 miles away when we have no say in how those taxes are used? One man muttered in the crowded streets of Boston. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," began to spread. Tensions boiled over in 1770 when British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of angry colonists in Boston. 5 people were killed in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Word of the event spread quickly through the colonies, fanning the flames of resentment. 3 years later, the Tea Act pushed the anger even further. It gave one British company the exclusive right to sell tea in the colonies, effectively forcing colonists to pay more and eliminating local merchants. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of men disguised as native warriors boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped over 300 chests of tea into the icy water. The Boston Tea Party had begun. Britain's response was swift and harsh. They closed Boston's port, restricted town meetings, and sent more soldiers to enforce their rule. Many colonists were furious. If they can take away Boston's liberty, they can take away ours, people said in taverns and town squares. Delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. They were farmers, lawyers, merchants, and ministers. Men who had little in common beyond their shared belief that something had to change. For now, they stopped short of calling for independence. They sent petitions to King George III, asking him to respect the colony's rights, but the king refused to listen. Instead, he sent more troops. By the spring of 1775, the colonies were on the brink of war. In April, British soldiers marched toward the small towns of Lexington and Concord, hoping to seize weapons stored by colonial militias. But local Minutemen, ordinary farmers, and tradesmen who had trained to fight at a moment's notice stood in their way. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it rang out like a spark in dry grass. The Revolutionary War had begun. News of the fighting spread rapidly, and militias across the colonies prepared for battle. Some men were eager to fight for freedom, others hesitated, torn between loyalty to England and loyalty to their neighbors. In May, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. This time, the tone was different. George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army, and whispers of full independence grew louder. You remember standing outside the Pennsylvania State House one sweltering summer day in 1776, listening as the delegates debated inside. Could the colonies truly break away from England? It seemed impossible, and yet, when Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was read aloud on July 4th, the crowd erupted with cheers. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Jefferson had written that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The words stirred something deep inside you. The colonies were no longer simply English settlements. They were becoming something new, but independence would not come easily. The British Army was the most powerful in the world, and the Continental Army was poorly trained and poorly supplied. The road ahead would be long and uncertain. Yet as you stood there in the summer heat, the echo of Jefferson's words ringing in your ears, you believed that the colonies might just succeed, because the desire for freedom had taken root, and nothing, not even the might of the British Empire, could easily uproot it. The Revolutionary War, a fight against the world's greatest army, and a people determined to be free. The summer of 1776 had been filled with hope, but that hope was soon tested. The British Army arrived in New York Harbor with hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers. The sight was enough to chill even the bravest hearts. They have everything, one soldier muttered as you watched the red-coated troops march in perfect lines. Cannon, muskets, discipline. We have hope. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, was small and inexperienced. Farmers and blacksmiths traded their plows and hammers for muskets, but most had never fought in a battle. Supplies were scarce, and many soldiers lacked proper uniforms or even shoes. The British struck hard and fast. They pushed Washington's army out of New York and chased them across New Jersey. Morale plummeted. Desertion rates soared. Some feared the dream of independence would end before it had truly begun. But Washington refused to give up. On a frigid Christmas night in 1776, he led his men across the icy Delaware River. You remember the sting of the wind as the soldiers pushed their boats through the freezing current, the oars creaking with each pull. At dawn, they surprised a Hessian garrison at Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers. The victory was small, but it proved that the Continental Army could win. More battles followed. The war stretched across the colonies, from the forests of New England to the swamps of the Carolinas. Each victory felt hard-won, each loss devastating. In 1777, the Americans won a major victory at Saratoga in New York. It was a turning point. The French, impressed by the colonists' determination, agreed to join the fight against Britain. Their navy and supplies would prove invaluable in the years to come. Still, the winter at Valley Forge tested the army like nothing before. You remember the bitter cold seeping into your bones, the hunger that gnawed at your stomach. Men wrapped their feet in rags when their shoes wore out. Disease swept through the camp. And some days, it felt as though death was winning. But Washington's presence held the army together. He rode among the tents, speaking quietly to the soldiers, reminding them of what they were fighting for. "We are not just fighting for today," he told you one night as the snow fell softly around the campfires. "We are fighting for generations yet unborn." Those words carried you through the darkest days. By 1781, the war reached its climax. Washington and his French allies cornered British General Cornwallis at Yorktown. Virginia, the siege was brutal. Cannon fire thundered day and night, shaking the earth and lighting up the sky with fiery arcs. You loaded artillery until your hands blistered, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Finally, on October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was not over everywhere, but Yorktown was the breaking point. The British Parliament, weary of the cost and the endless fighting, began negotiations. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The United States of America was officially recognized as a free and independent nation. You stood on a quiet hillside the day the news reached your town, listening as the church bells rang in celebration. Children ran through the streets waving scraps of cloth dyed red, white, and blue. For the first time, you allowed yourself to believe it was real. The war had been long and bitter. Friends and family had been lost. Cities had been burned. But the dream that began in Philadelphia in 1776 had endured. As you looked at the young faces around you, you wondered what this new nation would become. Would it hold together? Would it live up to the ideals written in the Declaration of Independence? No one knew, but for now, the future belonged to the people because they had fought. And they had won, and the world would never be the same. Building a new nation, a fragile experiment in freedom, and the first steps of the United States of America. The Revolutionary War was over. The ink on the Treaty of Paris was dry, and the 13 colonies were now independent states. But as the church bells rang and the celebrations echoed across the countryside, an unsettling question hung in the air. What now? The war had united the colonies against a common enemy, but building a nation was an entirely different challenge. The new United States was a patchwork of regions, each with its own priorities. New England's bustling ports and tight-knit towns had little in common with the plantation fields of the South. Western settlers wanted more land, while coastal merchants worried about trade and taxes. The first system of government, the Articles of Confederation, was weak by design. No president, no national court system, and Congress, the only federal institution, had almost no power to raise money or enforce its laws. At first, many were glad to keep the government small. They had just fought a war to free themselves from a powerful monarchy. No one wanted to replace King George with another ruler. But soon, the cracks began to show. States printed their own money, leading to chaos and inflation. Debts from the war piled up, and Congress had no reliable way to pay them. Trade disputes erupted between states, and in some places, Farmers were pushed off their land when they could not pay their taxes. In 1786, desperate farmers in Massachusetts rose up in armed rebellion, led by Daniel Shays. They marched on courthouses and government buildings, demanding relief. The uprising was put down, but it sent a chilling message. The young nation could fall apart before it even began. Leaders from across the states realized something had to change. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the Constitutional Convention. The heat was stifling, the debates fierce. How much power should the federal government have? How would small states be protected from larger ones? And perhaps most difficult of all, how would the new nation handle the issue of slavery? There were no easy answers, but after months of compromise, the delegates produced a document that balanced power between the states and the national government, the United States Constitution. It created a president to lead the executive branch, a Congress with two houses to make laws, and a Supreme Court to interpret them. It also included a system of checks and balances so that no single branch could grow too powerful. When the Constitution was sent to the states for ratification, it sparked intense debate. Some feared it gave too much power to the federal government. Others worried it did not do enough to protect individual freedoms. To address those fears, the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights were added. They guaranteed basic liberties like freedom of speech, religion, and the press. By 1789, the Constitution had been ratified, and the United States of America had a new framework of government. George Washington, the hero of the Revolutionary War, was elected as the nation's first president. You remember the day of his inauguration? The crowd gathered in New York City's Federal Hall was silent as Washington placed his hand on a Bible and swore the oath of office. His voice was calm, but you could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes. "This is no easy task," a man beside you whispered, and it was not. The new nation faced enormous challenges. There were foreign threats, internal divisions, and the lingering wounds of a war that had torn communities apart. But there was also a sense of possibility. In the years that followed, the United States began to grow. New states joined the Union. Roads and canals linked distant regions. The economy, still fragile, started to recover. You could feel the country taking shape. Though it was far from perfect, there were still deep inequalities, particularly for women, enslaved people, and native tribes whose lands were being pushed farther west. Yet, for all its flaws, the young nation was determined to endure. One evening, as you stood on a hill overlooking a small town lit by the warm glow of lanterns, you thought of how far you had come since Jamestown and Plymouth, since the first desperate winters when survival seemed impossible. Now, there was a constitution, a president, a new identity, a nation. It was still fragile, still learning how to balance freedom and order, but it was alive. And as the night wind rustled through the trees, you felt a quiet certainty. The story of the United States was only just beginning. As you step back from this journey through America's earliest years, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what came before us. We've walked with the settlers who crossed the Atlantic, fought through bitter winters at Plymouth, and witnessed a nation born from courage and hope. We've seen how fragile freedom can be, and how fiercely people will fight to protect it. There are lessons in their struggles that still echo today. We learned that unity is never easy. 13 colonies, each with their own needs and fears, had to choose trust over division. We learned that sacrifice often paves the way for future generations, and that progress is built one hard choice at a time. And perhaps most importantly, we learned that a single moment, a signature, a vote, a stand against injustice can change the course of history. To everyone who has joined me on this journey, thank you. Thank you for listening, for imagining these stories as vividly as they were lived, and for helping keep history alive. I would love to hear from you. What stood out to you most about the birth of this nation? What lessons do you think still matter most today? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let's continue the conversation together. And if you found yourself inspired by this story, I invite you to share it with someone else. These quiet stories deserve to be remembered. But we're not done yet, because the story of America doesn't end here. In the next episode, we'll step into the 19th century, an era of westward expansion, invention, and new challenges that would test the strength of the young United States. We'll witness the Louisiana Purchase, the building of canals and railroads, and the first sparks of divisions that would one day erupt into civil war. It's a story of ambition, resilience, and transformation, and you won't want to miss it. So stay with me, subscribe, follow, and join me for the next chapter in this journey through history. Because the best way to understand who we are is to remember where we came from